through, like Brother Steve said, an empty vessel, a man who's emptied himself and is so filled with the Spirit of God that we can be sure that we're going to hear from the Lord. Because if you expect to hear from the Lord, you will today. And with that, I'd like to bring to you my friend, Pastor Garry Patrylo. He's a gentleman who's also the pastor of House on the Rock Church in Far Rockaway. Believe it or not, he's got 5 kids. 5, say 5. 5 kids. And one wife, and a good one too. And she let him out tonight, this morning rather, to speak with you. And what excites me the most about Pastor Garry is that he's emerging. He's an emerging figure in the New York region. I personally believe God is going to use him in a way we haven't seen. He's on the younger side of the pastors in the region today. I think he's about 40-ish, just had his 40th birthday. Maybe I missed the 41st or 42nd, but he's around there. And we have an award in MDM called the Fisher of Men Award. And that award has been given to Dr. A.R. Bernard. The award has been given to Dr. Dwayne Durst, the superintendent of the New York Assemblies of God. That award has been given to Pastor Steve Milazzo, Pastor Dominic Cartagnola. And this man has won the award this year, and he was to be honored this year at the Discipleship Boot Camp that, of course, we had to cancel because of COVID. But you get them all to yourself, guys. You get them all to yourself to listen to them. So I want you to take notes. I want you to take some good notes and listen up good to my friend and Fisher of the Men Award winner this year because of what he's doing with men, Pastor Garry Patrylo.
Well, thank you so much, Pastor Scott. Really appreciate you and the Men's Discipleship Network, of course, and that introduction. It certainly was humbling to be notified that I was going to be the 2020 Fisher of Men recipient. Maybe even more humbling to find out that it wasn't going to happen. But I thank God that he, through this time of COVID-19 and unrest, uncertainty, in our country and our world, he's helping for us as men of God to really value what's most important in life. And that, of course, first and foremost is himself. He is the reward, and it's all about Jesus. So glad to be here with you, mighty men of God, this morning. And we're going to talk about, if I had to put a title, I guess, to this talk this morning, it would be "The Battle Rages On." The battle rages on. I was thinking about different wars that have taken place in our country that we've been a part of or in the world. I tried to look up, there's not an accurate assessment as to how many wars have existed since the creation of Adam and Eve. But there are some approximations that is in the thousands, some even in the tens of thousands, that put the number of the amount of wars and conflicts that have existed since the beginning of time. And the United States, as most of you probably know, have been involved in at least 12 major wars. And then also there's been several more conflicts that we've been involved in. The United States, just for a frame of reference, we spend about $700 billion a year on the military in the United States. And some of the most bloodiest battles or wars in our history, I'm thinking of the Battle of Antietam in September 17th, 1862, where within a 12-hour span, 25% of the Union troops and 31% of the Confederate troops were wounded, captured, or killed. And then, of course, I think of other battles during other wars. D-Day comes to mind, where if you count for the death on both sides of the soldiers that have were killed in that battle, it's at least at about 10,000 that died on that one day during that one battle. And so what do I learn, from looking at the history of not only America, but even more so the world since Adam and Eve and all of these wars, all of these conflicts? I learn that human beings are capable of devastating destruction. I think of some acts within war that cause so many deaths. I'm thinking of the atomic bomb. If you attribute the deaths that took place even after the initial dropping of that bomb, it's estimated that over 200,000 people were killed through that bombing. I'm thinking, of course, of even the Holocaust. 6 million Jews, 5 million others were killed during those years that we call the Holocaust. And when I look at all of this, I think of where we are today, especially, Pastor Scott mentioned my age. I'm 41, Pastor Scott. And I think that many in the maybe younger generation, especially, they don't understand the true devastation of war, maybe because we haven't had many conflicts really on our shores that have impacted many of us who are younger very directly. And the most recent wars that we have had, or battles, conflicts, things like, Afghanistan, for example, the numbers of casualties, even though, of course, one we would all consider to be significant, but they're not nearly the large amount of other wars and battles that have taken place in the past. And I think another reason that maybe our society today, and perhaps, we can argue the younger generation, does not really understand the true devastation of war, is because our comforts in America have too often served as a distraction from the very real truth that there are still currently, right now, major issues going on in the world today, right now. I think we can very easily become pacified in the United States of America to the fact that there are major issues going on in the world today. So here's just a few brief examples. People may be surprised to hear this, it seems, but slavery exists today, right now. Slavery exists today in certain parts of the world. People are still starving to death and malnourished. In several countries, the children are surprised, or people are surprised in their culture, if children make it past 5 years old because of starvation, because of malnourishment. Poverty, extreme poverty, exists today throughout the world. And then, of course, for another example that I can give you is the genocide of the unborn exists today. And it's very interesting how we've allowed ourselves in this country to be so pacified by our comforts, to be so isolated often in our own bubble, that we don't realize that some of the very things we would stand against and we say we stand against are happening elsewhere, but often we say nothing about it. We don't think about it. We're not even praying about it for many. And the attitude of many in our country, it seems, would be one that would make you think that they don't believe these problems, still exist. We're oblivious to physical wars, battles, problems. If that's true, what I'm saying, and I imagine that many of you would agree, at least in part, then how oblivious do you think people are to the fact that we are in a spiritual war? How oblivious do you think people are to the fact that we are in a spiritual war? And then I would ask this question: how well do you think an army of soldiers would do in a battle they didn't even realize they were in? How well do you think a group of soldiers would do in a battle they didn't even realize they were in. And so if you haven't guessed by now, I'm talking about Christians. I'm talking about the church. I'm talking about us as men of God, part of the Men's Discipleship Network. You've probably noticed, as I have, over the last 4 months since COVID-19 caused our churches to be forced to close in New York City, in New York. You've probably noticed that it did not take long for there to be an extreme decline in our society in just 4 months of churches being closed. And we, by many, are labeled as non-essential, as insignificant. Some would even try to make the argument that we as Christians and we as the church are the problem. And yet I want you to imagine what life would be like if the church was removed from society today. And I think COVID-19 has given us a little glimpse of what would take place, the rapid decline that would happen if the church was not doing what God has called the church to do. And so we are in a spiritual war, and usually those that don't realize it, they're either on the wrong side of this spiritual war, or they're getting demolished by the enemy. And maybe they don't even realize that that's what's happening to them, to their families, in their life. And so this morning, again, the title would be "The Battle Rages On." And if you look up that word rages, it really indicates severe violence and really with a degree of anger. And so the enemy of our souls, the devil, he is shrewd, he's bold, he's stubborn in his efforts to steal, kill, and destroy. And so we as men of God, we as Christians, we as leaders in the church, leaders in our family, and we as the church, we need to not wave the white flag of surrender to the enemy, but we even more so need to understand that there needs to be a purposeful battle that we are involved in order to combat the areas of our life that the enemy is trying to steal, kill, and destroy. And of course, we're not alone in that. There's someone who's leading us and who has really won the war already. So we're going to look this morning at a couple of thoughts. The first one in reference to what maybe we need to know about this spiritual battle. Number one, the battle belongs to the Lord. The battle belongs to the Lord. And maybe you come from a church that has started singing that contemporary song in the last year or two. It says, "I'm going to see a victory. I'm going to see a victory, for the battle belongs to the Lord." And I think that that simple chorus really hits home the fact that if we want to see victory in our lives, we need to understand that there is victory in Jesus Christ. And he is the one that we are looking to. He is the one from where our strength comes from. He is the one whose name we are marching on under with that banner of that cross. And so when I think of battle and I think of war and I think of Bible stories and characters and verses, I think David, King David, is one of the best examples that we can look at. And the story that probably many of us learned even as children was the story of David and Goliath. And as I read the story of David and Goliath, there's a couple of things that I realize about David. There's nothing to indicate that David could beat Goliath on his own, under his own skill or natural power. Now, there are some stories in the Bible that talk about David who killed a lion and David killed a bear. But I want to remind you, Goliath, historians tell us, was somewhere around 9 feet plus tall. And he was trained for battle from a young age, and his weapons and his armor, certainly the way in which he spoke, indicate that he probably was amongst the most fierce opponent that a person could ever have in battle. So yeah, I know David, protected his sheep, and the Bible tells us these stories of defeating a lion, defeating a bear. But I don't think that when you look at who Goliath was, that if there was betting going around during the time of David and Goliath, that there would be many people putting the favor on David. I'm pretty sure that the majority of people would assume that Goliath would be winning this battle. And so, to give you some other indication that, David wasn't necessarily someone that stood out as a fierce warrior that you'd even put up against Goliath, remember when he was anointed by Samuel. His father and brothers didn't even really consider him. Was it because he was younger? Was it because he was smaller? Was it because he was less gifted, less talented? What did they have him do? Taking care of the sheep. Nothing seemed to stand out specifically about David, at least in the eyes of those that were around him. We even read, of course, that once he does, make the decision and volunteer to fight Goliath, that he would not even be in armor. And so who would put their bet on David in this situation? Another indication to look at is simply this: he wasn't in the battle to begin with. He was clearly not someone that would be considered to be battle worthy. He wasn't even enlisted. He wasn't there with the 3 older brothers that were involved in this war, involved in this conflict on the front lines. And so the point this morning, number one, the battle belongs to the Lord. But there's a second component to this other than that truth, which is extremely important. The battle belongs to the Lord, but right here, stay on this screen if you would. The second part, look at the bottom, next to David on the right side. The point number 2 here, but you still have to fight. You still have to be engaged. You still have to get in the ring. And so this is how I'd like to describe that for you this morning. The only thing that David had that he could possibly add to God's ability and power to defeat Goliath was himself. The only thing that David could add, because God could have defeated Goliath on his own. It wasn't David's skill. It wasn't even his slingshot ability. The only thing that God needed was a man to stand. The only thing that God needed was a person who was willing to let God work through them. That's what David brought to the table, and that's really the only thing any of us can bring to the table. To say, God, here I am. Use me for your glory. Lord, I take a stand for righteousness. I take a stand for your name and everything your name represents. And I'm getting in the ring because I want my life to glorify you. Do you realize this morning there is no other you? I know that sounds very cliche, but it's true. There is no other you. God has called you his son. God has called you his soldier. And the battles he wants you to win are going to be battles that are going to glorify himself through your life. Do you know what David ultimately had in order to get into that ring? He had guts. He had guts. He had conviction, and he had faith. His guts, his conviction, and his faith is what caused him to volunteer to be a soldier of God, representing God, standing up for God, defending the name of God against the biggest adversity he had faced to date. And so God wants us as men to have guts, to have conviction, to have faith. And I think it's true, and I can see in some ways where throughout our history as a country, or maybe at least we can say in the last generation or two, there seems to be some of this missing from manhood. Some of this missing even from men of God in churches who call themselves Christians. And I do think that there are some things that have gotten better in our thinking and understanding as men. I think there were some things that we prided ourselves in at certain points in history that maybe were wrong or needed to adjust or needed to change. But I also think that in some of that adjustment and change, we've lost some of the essence of what really makes a man a man. And I think these three words, guts, conviction, and faith, might very well be a part of what's been lost by many men in our world, and very sadly, even in the church. And so the story of David and Goliath certainly would not be the same if David did not get in the ring to fight Goliath. Could you imagine that story? Would it be nearly as exciting? I don't even think we would have heard it as children if the story was just Goliath. how God killed Goliath on his own. No. The story requires David in David and Goliath. And so God has chosen us, he's called us, and we cannot do it alone. But at the same time, he has chosen in his divine wisdom to not do it without us either. He wants to do it with you. And this next slide that you'll see, not only does the battle belong to the Lord, not only do we still have to fight and be engaged in the battle, but this next slide, you are not meant to fight this battle alone. You and I are not meant to fight this battle alone. And of course, we know that we need God. We established that in the first point. We cannot win this battle without the Lord. The battle belongs to him. But it's not just the Lord that we need, or just the Lord that he's designed to be with us in the battle. We are not meant to fight this battle alone. And so this next picture is a phrase that the Lord gave me several years ago in reference to the church. It simply says, unite and fight, or give up your rights. Unite, fight, or give up your right. And I'm amazed at how quickly, if we want to show this maybe more physically, I could use maybe the example of America and where we are today. I'm amazed at how quickly we are as Americans to give up our right. And if we're so quickly to do that in a physical way, then I'm not surprised how quickly we are as Christians to give up our right in a spiritual sense. And so unite, fight, or give up your right. We have a right because of what Christ did on the cross to be called the sons of God. We have a right, because of what Jesus did on the cross, to be enlisted in the greatest army, fighting the greatest battle for the greatest cause ever to be imagined in our world. We have a right to all that's contained in the name of Jesus. We have a right, but all too quickly, we give up that right because we're not in the fight and because we're not united in the fight that God has called us as Christian men to be a part of. Look at the Israelites in this story of David and Goliath. How quickly they were ready to give up their right as the chosen people by losing this battle, by not even fighting in this battle. I want to read some of these verses for you this morning. Chapter 17 of 1 Samuel. The Bible says in verse 8, Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistines said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man, let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' word, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Dismayed and terrified. They weren't going to unite. They weren't going to fight. They weren't believing that there was one even amongst them that can win this battle. And as a result of that, they were willing to give up their right because of fear. Verse 20, going on in the story. Early in the morning, David, what did he do? He left his flock of sheep in care of a shepherd. He loaded up. He set out as his father Jesse directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. Can you imagine that scene in your mind this morning? David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Once again, willing to give up their God-given right because of fear. Verse 40, then he took his staff in his hand. This is David, after volunteering to fight Goliath, couldn't fit in King Saul's armor. And I want you to think about that from the perspective of the Israelites, from the perspective of King Saul. How and why would they ever let someone who didn't seem capable fight this battle for them? Really shows you how unwilling they were to get in the ring themselves. It really shows you that. And there are men of God, men in our church. I'll give you an example, if I can, maybe a little more personally. But there are men that have been a part of our church for many, many years. And they especially after my dad passed away and I became the lead pastor of our church, and we had to relaunch our church because of Hurricane Sandy. Especially after that, I was looking for men that could unite with me and help me in the very difficult task of restarting our church. I wish I could have looked to the men who were around for years at House on the Rock Church. But there were 2-3 men in particular who were so lukewarm, so independable, that they could not be challenged with the task of partnering with me to help relaunch the church. Now, the Lord still worked, and it took some time, and God began to bring men into our church that were new, that were on fire for him. And as a result, we have a growing men's ministry and a growing church. But it's not because of the 2-3 men that were on the sidelines. It's not because of them. To this day, they're semi a part of our church, but they're not really engaged in the battles that we are currently in and have won over the last 8 years since Hurricane Sandy. Many battles that have been won to glorify God in our community, through our church, in our families, and yet they were not a part of it. In fact, there were times, especially in the beginning, that some of them were bothered by the fact that other men were coming in, bothered by the fact that God was saving other men and using other men, raising them up as soldiers. And so in many ways, those men who could not unite, who did not want to fight, they may come around here and there, but they are living a Christian life that is never going to satisfy. And many men like that become, to use the phrase, disenchanted with the Christian faith, because they've never truly been living out the Christian faith. They're just somewhere in the middle, and it is never going to work. But David, who was younger, these men I was talking about in my church, they were older. They should have been the ones we all looked to. Instead, God had to bring in new believers and younger men. And I would challenge you in your churches as you restart. The Lord needs you, men of God, as those who've been around longer, those who maybe are wiser, those who've been battle tested, to help lead an army, especially in this next generation. Do not become so frustrated with what you see is happening in our society and in the world that you think it's too hard to overcome, that you're so fearful that you'd rather send someone ill-equipped to face the enemy. No, you with that young man, you with that new Christian, face the enemy together. Well, David took the 5 stones, he put them in his pouch, he took his sling, he approached the Philistine. Everyone else, when they see him, is running the other way. But when David sees him, he approaches him. It reminds me of the heroes that we hear stories about. 9/11 is a great example. Everyone's running out of the building. And here are people who were literally about to put their life on the line, running inside the building. Verse 41, meanwhile, the Philistine with his shield bearer in front of him kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He despised him. You know, the devil despises those with potential. He wants to squash things before they even get started in a person's life. And you are filled with potential. He said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. But David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, who you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. Let me tell you something. Guts, we said that he had conviction and faith. Any of these other men in the Israelite army had the potential to be David, but they didn't stand. They didn't know God the way that David knew God. And when you know God like David knew God, you'll take a stand like David took a stand. All those gathered here will know that this is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, but the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. And so the Philistine in verse 48 came closer to attack him. David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David, in verse 50, triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. So this morning, do you recognize that the battle belongs to the Lord, but he wants and he's ordained for you to be in the battle in order to win a victory in your life and through your life in this world with the many battles that we face as a church, as Christians, to glorify your Father in heaven. And do you realize this morning that you are not meant to face this battle alone? Not only do you have God, but I believe that there are many Davids being raised up. And instead of there being one David with an army behind him that's afraid, let there be an army of Davids. Could you imagine what can take place in our families and in our churches and in our communities if we would rise up as an army of Davids? There's a song that I'll close with that we grew up singing in the church that I was saved in and our family was saved in. You would recognize at least the title as Onward Christian Soldiers. But listen to these lyrics. Onward Christian soldiers marching as to war, with the cross of Jesus going on before. Christ, the royal master, leads against the foe. Forward into battle, see his banner go. At the sign of triumph, Satan's host doth flee. On, then, Christian soldiers, on to victory. Hell's foundations quiver at the shout of praise. Brothers, lift your voices, loud your anthems raise. Like a mighty army moves the church of God. Brothers, we are treading where the saints have trod. We are not divided, all one body we, one in hope and doctrine, one in charity. Onward then, ye people, join our happy throng. Blend with us your voices in the triumph song. Glory, laud, and honor unto Christ the King. This through countless ages, men and angels sing. Onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to war, with the cross of Jesus going on before. So if you are sick and tired of being defeated and feeling like as a church in our society and our world is being defeated, then maybe it's time to take a cue from David, and it's time to have the guts, and it's time to have the faith, and it's time to have the conviction. It's time to know God like David knew God, and it's time to take a stand and go into battle like he has called us to go and win a mighty victory for his name. God bless you guys.
Amen. Pastor Garry, thank you very much for your preparation and that powerful word. Gentlemen, in a minute, I'm going to pass it over to Coach Carlos to take the offering. But before I do, I just want to remind you that we have a chat set up, and we're going to do a little bit of Q&A. And so I would encourage you to put your questions in the chat, and I will go through them and call them out to Pastor Garry and to Pastor Scott too. Over to you, Coach Carlos, for the offering.
Good morning, men. And thank you, Pastor Garry, for, wow, a stirring and a great sermon. I call it a sermon. I hope you do too. I took so many notes and just from the story and how David stood up. And well, right now, let me just cut to the chase. It's time to take up an offering. And as Pastor Garry mentioned, there's many battles going on, and Men's Discipleship Network itself is going on with a battle. But you know, before I don't want to get ahead of myself, I do also want to thank the new people that have joined that are online, and I want to thank them and grant them favor and grace for joining us. I also want to thank the men that give each week and monthly. I mean, we don't take it for granted, and it's a vital part of our existence. So, but as you can see, again, for the offering, there's 3 ways to give. You can text. You see the number on the screen. That's one way. There's another. You text the word give. Let me not jump ahead. Text the word give after you type in the number. The second way is to go to the website, Men's Discipleship Network, and you can give that way. Or you can write a check to Men's Discipleship Network and mail it to 27 Grand Avenue in Farmingdale. The other, or the last way, and we've mentioned before, is that there will be an email that will be sent to you, and you can just click on that and send in. But, you know, I just want to chime in and say, listen, MDN is having a battle, just a struggle for survival in these times with the COVID and everything going on, and we're not meeting. And obviously, it's a blessing to have you men online with us. And I got to tell you, it's not easy, and there are expenses that have to be met, and we count on each and every one of you. So I am praying that you heard this message about the battle, and don't stand on the sideline, but join in and give as much as you can, because it's going to go to, there's fruitful ground here at MDN, and we're counting on each and every one of you. So God bless you all, and I turn it over to Coach Steve.
All right. Thank you, brother.